Well, Pete, February 2023, cold nights, but long nights and plenty to see. So let's start with the inner solar system as we usually do and work our way outwards.
Yeah.
So planet Mercury reached greatest western elongation on the 30th of January. It's now a low morning object. Its altitude before sunrise is dropping, and despite being around magnitude 0 for the first half of February, and brightening to minus 0.5 by the end of the month, it's still going to be quite a tricky target to see, I think.
It's not going to be brilliant, is it? But its inner solar system neighbour, the planet Venus, is now in the opposite part of the sky. It's in the evening sky, and it sets about 2 hours 15 minutes after sunset at the start of February, which gives a reasonable opportunity to see its shining away in the evening twilight. This very, very beautiful planet. It's about mag minus 3.8 at the beginning of February. And to be honest, that brightness, it's going to be hard to miss, isn't it?
It's really quite a striking object. Your eye is drawn to it immediately. It does look like the landing lights for sort of nearby aircraft, I always think, when it's that kind of bright.
Well, there are stories about pilots sort of seeing Venus and reacting because they think it's a plane coming towards them. I've heard actually from pilots, I've always mentioned that it's apocryphal as a story, and they go, no, it has actually happened.
Yeah,
so
I can believe it. It does look like an aircraft. And telescopically, of course, it's in the gibbous phase at the moment. Still quite a long way off from us, but as spring presses and as the months go on, Venus will be coming closer towards us and will be quite a fine sight in the evening skies for a while to come.
Wonderful when it's in the spring sky. But there are some events happening with Venus in February. For example, on the evenings of the 14th and 15th of February, Venus will be very close to the planet Neptune. So that's the brightest planet in the solar system, as seen from Earth, Venus, and the dimmest planet, Neptune. So they'll be pretty close together. In fact, from the UK, the separation on the 14th of February is 50.2 arc minutes, which reduces to 21.8 arc minutes on the 15th. So that's pretty close.
Yes, and it'll be a nice, easy way of finding Neptune if you've never seen it before, because Venus is a very, very bright target and easy to see.
Yes, it is indeed. But there is another planet, actually, which is going to be very close to Venus at the end of the month, because on the evening of the 22nd of February, mag minus 3.9 Venus will sit 7.5 degrees from mag minus 2.0 Jupiter, and there'll be a slender 8% lit waxing crescent moon joining the party on that date. Now, that separation is going to reduce as we go through the end of February and into the beginning of March. So that's going to be something to really look out for. That'll create quite a stir because those two planets are pretty bright.
Yes, it'd be quite an interesting grouping of objects in the evening sky. All right, well, moving out then, planet Mars. So we've had a great Mars apparition. It's been one of those apparitions where the planet's been reasonably high in the sky and got really fairly close to us, 17.1 arc seconds towards opposition. But it is now moving away from us. But even with a medium-sized telescope, there's still plenty to see. On the 1st of February, it's fairly bright, magnitude minus 0.2 and about 10 arc seconds across. But by the end of February, it's dropped in magnitude to plus 0.4 and a smaller diameter of 8 arc seconds in the planets in constellation of Taurus for the whole month. But there's still plenty to see on the surface. You can see the northern polar cap still, and some of the darker markings should be visible even in small telescopes.
It's been beautifully placed, very high up. And of course, we had it through early December in that really cold period as well, when it did its occultation behind the moon, which was really quite a special event. But now, of course, as you say, it's heading away from Earth and it's on the wane. But it is still worth having a look at Mars. It's still pretty well placed, still well positioned, reaching an altitude of about 62 degrees up when due south at the beginning of February. So make the best of this good positioning of Mars. Okay, what about Jupiter then? Well, Jupiter is rapidly losing ground to the evening twilight, and it appears 29 degrees above the southwest horizon under deep twilight conditions at the start of the month. But Towards the end of the month, well, telescopically, the window's starting to close, I guess you'd say, because it'll only be 12 degrees up above the western horizon at the end of February.
This is the thing about Jupiter. It hangs around for ages in the twilight, low down. It's towards the end of its apparition. It just seems reluctant to go, and it's always...
It's Mars that does that to the biggest extent.
True.
Mars drives me crazy because it's such a fast-moving planet relative to the others that it actually manages to almost compensate for its drift westward towards the sun. So it sits there for ages and ages in a really poor position, really small.
I can forgive Mars because we only get it once every 2 years, but Jupiter just... Get on with the conjunction with the sun and let's start again.
We're very
impatient.
Impatient with planets.
Imagine if we could arrange the celestial universe to our own needs, Pete. We would have lots of oppositions and everything at a much more convenient time.
I'd feel really sorry for the Southern Hemisphere.
They'd see nothing. They would get nothing. All right. So, as you say, Pete, Jupiter is really coming to the end of its observational part of its apparition. It's been a good one. Jupiter's been the best it has been for quite a few years, actually. But there are a number of things you can still see, even with a small telescope, even though it's low down. The two main belts, the north and south equatorial belts, will be visible. The Great Red Spot is quite small now and quite tricky, so you'd need very good seeing to see that with a small telescope.
Yeah.
But the 4 Galilean moons, those are very, very easy to see.
They always look great, don't they?
They do, and we've had some nice events with them over the last couple of months, with them passing to and fro behind and in front of Jupiter.
Yeah. Okay, well, Saturn, you're not going to see Saturn this month because it's in conjunction with the Sun on the 16th of February, so it's out of the way. So that leaves Uranus and Neptune. Uranus is still reasonably well placed, actually. It's no longer visible at its highest position under astronomically dark skies, but as true darkness falls at the beginning of February, it's still 52 degrees up, which is pretty good.
Yeah, that's not bad, and still the highest out of all the planets. You'll need binoculars, I think, to see it convincingly, and a small telescope really does show the greenish colour. Next planet out, Neptune. The observing window closes on Neptune this month. Quite a dim planet. You can't see this without optical aid, and it's just 16 degrees up as true darkness falls at the start of February, but unable to see it against really dark skies from the 22nd of February onwards. So that's going to be quite tricky.
Yeah, but don't forget the conjunction between Venus and Neptune, because that's going to be give it a little bit of an extra lease of life, should we say. Okay, well, let's look at some of the specials which are occurring in February. And let's start with the moon. So on the 5th of February, the full moon occurs near apogee, and that's informally known as a micro-moon.
It's not informally known. It's only you that calls it a micro-moon.
No, it has been called that. And I like to bring this up because whenever the opposite one occurs, where it's close to perigee, he said supermoon there, everybody makes a huge fuss over it. But this is just the same, really. It's just the other side of its orbit, and nobody pays any attention to it at all.
So you're starting a one-man campaign to make the micro-moon relevant.
Micro-moon. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, dear. Anyway.
Well, another interesting thing on the 5th, actually, is that Mars, and wait for this, Mars and Aldebaran have a conjunction in right ascension.
Oh.
That is a true conjunction, actually. That often mention the word conjunction when you're talking about a pair of objects or more, and it tends to be applied to them when they're close together. But actually, there is a technical or formal definition of a conjunction. It's when the objects share a similar coordinate. So it can be a conjunction in right ascension, or it could be a conjunction in ecliptic longitude or galactic longitude. It doesn't matter. So that's the formal definition. So Mars and Aldebaran are actually going to be in a formal conjunction on the 5th of February.
And you compare the colours as well, because Aldebaran is a sort of orangey colour. It's an old giant star. I always think Mars looks the more orange of the two, but we can have a look. And in fact, Mars is just 8.2 degrees north of the star on that day. Well, I guess we should move on to the most interesting of the specials, at least I think it's the most interesting, and that is Comet C 2022 E3 ZTF.
Z?
Oh, Z. I was just trying to remember whilst I was reading it. What does the ZTF stand for? Can you remember?
It's the Zwicky Transient Facility.
I knew you'd know. Okay, so at the time that we are recording this, of course, we don't know whether this comet has really been quite bright or been a bit of a flop, but we'll proceed.
It's there. It's actually there. It's not bad at all, so I think it'll be worth keeping an eye out for.
The thing is,
go on.
That I don't. Even if the comet doesn't get to naked eye brightness, even if it would remain around sort of magnitude 6, they are fascinating objects to study.
Oh, they are. Completely.
They don't need to be big trailblazing comets in order to be astronomically interesting and beautiful objects to observe. So this comet could get as bright or as dim as it likes for me. I shall follow it with absolute joy, regardless.
Absolutely right. Well, the reason why we're mentioning it is that in theory, it should be sort of naked eye brightness towards the beginning of February. Now, you have to take that with a pinch of salt, because a comet's brightness is expressed in terms of what would happen if you took all its light and condensed it into a point source like a star. That star would be naked eye bright. But if the comet has an extended size, then the brightness is spread over that area. So its surface brightness is much dimmer, which makes it almost certainly going to be below naked eye threshold. But it should certainly be a binocular object. You should certainly be able to see it with binoculars. And it passes some key items in the night sky, which will allow you to locate it in an easier way. Now, obviously, go into the magazine and look at the big three and the calendar entries, and you'll see mention of the comet and where it is. But just to give you a heads up, on the 6th, the evening of the 6th, and into the following morning, magnitude 5.3, take it with a pinch of salt, Comet C 2022 E3 ZCF will be heading south past the Kids asterism in Auriga. That is, the Kids asterism represents baby goats.
It's really just a little triangle on the right-hand side of Orion.
I think it's just the bottom two stars, actually.
Oh, is it? So it's not even...
Yeah.
So I need imagination for that bit. But on the 8th, this is the evening and into the following morning, still just about clinging to naked eye visibility if it does reach these predictions. 5.6, magnitude 5.6. It will be less than a degree west of magnitude 2.7 Iota Aurigae.
Iota,
which has a name.
It does have a name. Hasella.
Hasella.
Yeah.
That's a good name.
So on the 11th, the period from the morning of the 11th through to the following evening of the 11th again, sees the comet having a close encounter with Mars. And you can find more details about that in the magazine as well. And then it'll just keep on moving. So on the 13th, it passes just west of the open cluster NGC 1647 in Taurus. And then on the 14th, it's near Aldebaran. And then on the 18th, it's fading as it's travelling south past that line of stars that always looks like a bow in the constellation of Orion to me, but it's known as Orion's pies.
Oh, yes.
Pi 1 through to Pi 6. And they're quite faint, but they're quite distinctive. They sit off to the west of the constellation. And they do look like he's holding up a bow, but in reality, well, I say in reality, it's all made up anyway. He's holding up an animal skin there. That's what it's supposed to represent.
Yeah, it's supposed to be the animal skin of the lion, isn't it? But
it is.
I think you're right. Holding up a bow looks more likely and more in tune with a hunter. But there we are. Okay, so that'll be interesting to see. There's some nice events there. On the 15th, Venus and Neptune, as we've mentioned already, have a close encounter.
It's worth mentioning, actually, with that earlier in the day, because they'll appear about 20 arc minutes apart low above the western horizon on the evening of the 15th. But earlier in the day, they pass each other by just 47 arc seconds.
That's quite...
But you won't see that.
It's quite difficult, because I don't well, you could see Venus in the day, but I think you really struggle to see Neptune.
Yeah, you would.
So that'd be quite a tough call. Or the next day, 16th, there's a reasonable favourable libration on the moon. So the moon rocks back and forth in its orbit, and as a result of that, we can peer just over the limb, either side on the east or western side of the moon.
Yeah.
And this is a particular tilting of the western limb towards the Earth, which provides us with a good view of the Mare Orientale, the Eastern Sea, which, thanks to the IAU convention switching in the 60s, the Mare Orientale, the Eastern Sea, now lies on the western limb. But
Yes.
this will be a good one to try and catch, because it's quite a tough observation. You have to look beyond the Rook Mountains to see it, and it's quite tough.
I like this because it's really foreshortened, so you really have to work hard in terms of your imagination and your decoding skills to work out what it is you're seeing. Okay, on the 26th of February then, we have a 44% lit waxing crescent moon, which sits 2.7 degrees from the Pleiades open cluster. So that's always a nice pairing. The Pleiades stand out pretty well, and in its waxing state, the moon isn't bright enough to wash it out. And then as we get towards the end of the month, we've got Venus and Jupiter doing their close approach. But to end it all, on the 28th, Mars and the Moon will appear really close in the morning sky. And that's an interesting one, actually, Paul, because the separation will decrease as they approach setting. And there will be an occultation, but it won't be visible from the UK.
No, so we'll only get the first part of it as it gets closer and closer. But still, it'd be interesting to see how far you can follow it. The last occultation of Mars we had, I couldn't follow the re-emergence of Mars from behind the limb of the moon because the telescope was too far away wasn't conveniently situated. But I did struggle to see the planet Mars with the naked eye after the occultation because the moonlight was so bright.
It's interesting.
Mars was so close. It was quite tough.
I did try to watch it go in. You obviously got the telescope set up for imaging and concentrating on all those bits and pieces as well. But I did try to keep looking at it to see how close I could see Mars. And you do lose it after a while, actually, don't you? It sort of goes into the glare of the moon. Quite remarkable. It's the thing which struck me, actually, is the fact that as it gets closer, it seems to be quite a long way away, and you think that's never going to make it by the time that we've stated. But it does. The moon moves quite rapidly across the sky.
Yeah, and it's one of the few times you can actually tell celestial motion because you can see the moon and Mars, the separation. When they get to fairly close to each other, that gap, as you say, Pete, between the two of them does advance quite rapidly, and the moon closes in on Mars very quickly. And the occultation, I timed it as to be about 33 seconds. It's over quite quickly.
Yes, it is. Very quickly indeed. Okay, well, let's now head out into the night sky. And as the stars of winter are now beginning to wane and those of spring are eager to take their place, we still have a good view of Orion the Hunter. We need to mention that because Orion isn't going to hang around much longer as he gradually drifts to the west. So the evening twilight will expand rapidly and swallow Orion. He disappears really quickly, doesn't he?
It is. It's actually quite remarkable. It's there at the start of February, and by the end, it's gone.
It's struggling.
And it gets me every time how quickly that it's there. But even so, Orion can still be used to signpost to other stars and constellations that we've got in the sky at this time of year. If we follow the line from Rigel, that's the bluish-white star on the bottom right, through to Betelgeuse, the orange star on the top left, and extend the line for twice that distance again, we'll find the familiar stars Castor and Pollux in the constellation of Gemini, the twins. It's quite a distinctive constellation. It's not particularly bright, but that rectangle of stars, I think, is quite easy to pick out.
They do look like two stick figures, but they're on the side, of course, as we see them. And the interesting thing about Castor and Pollux is the fact that initially they look like they are twin stars. They're very similar. But if you stare at them, you notice the difference. Pollux is brighter and slightly redder in colour. And have you ever had a look at Castor through a telescope?
I have. Slightly yellowish, isn't it? And it's got some components to it as well, some binary
Well, it looks
components.
like a pair.
Yeah.
It's a really close pair. And it's basically, each of those stars is a spectroscopic binary, and there is a third visual component, which is also a spectroscopic binary. So the whole system is a sextuplet system.
That would be a very complicated place to live.
You'd never get any observing done.
No, it would be interesting, wouldn't it? The amount of shadows cast on the ground, and yeah, certainly very interesting. I did notice the colour of Castor Pollux, but simply because when setting up the go-to mount, often Pollux is the star when it's around, that it's one of the stars it chooses, and the colour is quite striking. It is quite an orange colour.
Yeah, it is indeed. Okay, well, the other amazing thing to look at in Gemini, of course, is the open cluster Messier 35, which is near the toe of Castor. And it's a beautiful cluster, which often gets overlooked. I don't know why, but it's fabulous through binoculars and great with a telescope. Very rich cluster.
I think that's probably why, because we all start off usually with smaller telescopes, learning the way around the sky. And small open clusters, well, even the cluster like the Pleiades or the Hyades, lend themselves well to low magnification, very small telescopes. But the minute you get larger telescopes, these clusters are actually, it's very difficult to get them all in the field, and you just get a couple of bright objects, and it's not as exciting. So I wonder if that's the reason why we tend to overlook them later on.
I don't know. It's a bit sad. So get outside and have a look at M35 because it's great. But if you turn your gaze to the northeast, you should be able to see that other familiar shape in the night sky. You've got Orion, which is really recognisable, but the other familiar shape is the plough or the saucepan. And in the hours before midnight, it appears to be doing a balancing act. So it's actually balancing on the point of its handle with the pan bit at the top. And that always looks quite dramatic to me, and it's always an indicator that we're starting to head into the spring months.
Oh, you're quite right. I've got two markers in the year. When I see the Pleiades in the night sky, Pleiades, however you want to pronounce it, can tell that, it's going to get colder and winter and Christmas aren't far away. When you see the plough as a question mark, you know that the spring and the shorter nights are here. So yeah,
it does look like a question mark.
It does.
Yes,
it does. So if you locate the four stars that mark the pan, so not the handle, the pan, and identify the pair closest to the handle, and then just draw a line from them to the right until you come to the next reasonably bright star, which is Alpha Leonis, or Regulus as we more commonly know it. This is one of the brightest stars in the constellation of Leo, and you'll know you've got the right star because it sits at the base of that backward question mark pattern known as the sickle of Leo.
Yes, it does. That's another question mark, isn't it, in the sky? Lots of question marks in the sky. So Regulus, which the name means little king. That marks the punctuation dot at the bottom of that backward question mark. It's supposed to represent the head of Leo, isn't it? The sickle.
Yeah, I mean, it looks more like a cat sitting sideways to me than a lion, but I don't know. At least it looks like what it represents. It's one of those constellations that is fairly distinctive, although not particularly bright, just like Gemini. It's fairly easy to stand out.
It is, yes. And the star at the other end of Leo, at the eastern end, is Denebula, which is a shortened form of Deneb Alased, which is from the Arabic phrase meaning tail of the lion. So there's no mistaking which part of Leo that represents. But yeah, it's a great constellation. It's, as you say, not particularly bright, but Regulus stands out well, and it does look a bit like a lion. And there's lots of galaxies in that area as well, of course, the Leo triplet coming to mind. But if you go between Leo, or more specifically between Regulus and Castor in Gemini, the midpoint goes slightly south of that position, and you come to another really famous open cluster, which is Messier 44, which is the beehive cluster, which sits at the centre of that inverted Y-shaped constellation of Cancer the Crab. Now, the beehive always gets the sort of headline press, doesn't it? It's a big thing. It's a very
pretty cluster.
It is a pretty cluster. It's supposed to look like bees buzzing around a hive, which to be honest, I think every cluster you could describe in that way. But the one which I think gets overlooked again is the one which is further south in Cancer, which is near Alpha Cancri or Accubans, and that's M67. And M67 is much dimmer. It's a very compressed cluster, though. Looks great through a telescope, and it's one of the oldest clusters known.
Yeah, it's a very, very pretty object, and I try and make a note to look at some of these objects when I've done the planetary observing of the evening. It is a very, very pretty cluster, M67, and doesn't get enough attention. Now, immediately to the south of the constellation Cancer is a small group of stars that resembles a sideways teardrop, and this is the head of Hydra, the water snake.
Hooray.
One of the largest constellations by area in the entire sky, and one of the dullest constellations by area in the entire night sky. Not much to say about it, is there? Because I think there's a planetary nebula in it, actually, isn't there, in Hydra?
There is indeed. Yes,
so,
it's near Mu Hydra,
yes.
and that's that's NGC 3242.
Yes, the ghost
which
of
is
Jupiter.
called the ghost of Jupiter. That's right. 'Cause
Yeah.
it looks like Jupiter in the sky. But yeah, it's quite interesting actually, because it's a massive constellation, sprawling, and there is a bit there where it has a lot of constellation, or not a lot, but a handful of constellations which are on its back, and there are some below as well. There's Antlia the Pump, which is to the south of it, which isn't very impressive at all. But even though there's not much to see between Antlia and the body of Hydra, it's worth noting that is where the French astronomer Joseph Jérôme Lefrançois de Lalande created the constellation of Felis the cat.
Oh, yes. Unfortunately, Felis never really got a lot of support, does it? Because it's not on any subsequent charts after that.
No, it just got dropped.
Yeah, fair enough.
So yeah, there's plenty to see out there in the spring sky. Take advantage of the lengthy dark nights of February, and just be careful of the cold freezing up your telescope
And your eyepieces. And you, if you're not wrapped up large enough.
No, you do need to be really careful, actually.
You do.
Yeah.
Okay, well, clear sky to everybody, and we'll be back next month to look at the constellations and things visible in March. Thanks, Pete.
Thank you, Paul.